launched. And you know, it was designed in the 1970s. I like to wow people when you stop and think about the timeline of aviation. We went from the Wright brothers' first flight in 1903 to the moon landing in 1969. That's 66 years. That's easily one person's lifetime. And then we did a lot of amazing things with the shuttle. A lot of people say you just went around the Earth in low Earth orbit for 30 years. But the amazing thing is that we developed so much technology and the capability and the operational capability to fly people in space routinely. The other question I frequently get is, you know, when are we going to get people back in space? Well, we don't get that so much anymore now that SpaceX has launched a crew. But you know, the space station has been continuously staffed with at least one American for 20 years now. So we always have somebody in orbit, and that's pretty cool. You know, the shuttle and I both retired from NASA, but I've managed to have a lot of fun in aviation, and so we'll talk a little bit about both. So basically, I've been a pilot for about 45 years now. I started out in J3 Cubs, and I'm an airplane owner and builder. The first airplane I owned was a beat up old Yankee back shortly after I got out of college. And yes, I'm a former manned spacecraft flight director. So the easiest way to talk about flight directors in movie terms is if you've seen the movie Apollo 13, and I imagine you probably all have. The guy in a white vest and the crew cut, Gene Kranz, was the flight director in the center of mission control, and that was my job. So I was the longest serving lead flight director in NASA space flight history. I was started out with NASA as a flight controller, did that for about a dozen years, and then I was selected as flight director in 1993 and did that for about almost 20 years before I retired. My call sign, if you ever see, we go back to Gene Kranz with his white vest. Gene wore a white vest because he was known as White Flight. Chris Kraft, a name you're probably familiar with, was Red Flight. The first three flight directors, Chris and Gene and John Hodge, were Red, White, and Blue Flight. And then when they brought on a couple more flight directors, they were Green Flight and Black Flight. Nobody wanted to be Yellow Flight, but somebody picked Gold and Silver. And by the time I was selected as flight director, I chose Iron as my call sign because I come from the Iron Ranges in northern Minnesota. My heritage is there. And so my call sign is Iron Flight, and sometimes you'll see me use that quite a bit in aviation these days. We really did stand on the shoulders of giants. When I was very fortunate to get to NASA as a co-op student in 1980, and all of the Apollo veterans were still there. And they were the ones who taught me the craft. They were the ones who taught me how we fly people in space. When I left 34 years later, it was my goal to make sure that I didn't take any of those lessons with me that I hadn't passed on to some of the next generation, to make sure that everybody got the benefit of that. Let's see. We'll talk a little bit about some airplanes, though. So I got my start rebuilding J3 Cubs. I was 13 years old. I was living in the northern suburbs of the Twin Cities, St. Paul, and there was an Explorer post formed. Now, this was back in the mid-1970s, early 1970s, actually. And an FBO, along with the 3M Aviation Club, some of its members that had airplanes on leaseback with him, bought a couple of J3 Cubs out of a chicken coop. They were actually L4s, World War II L4s. And and then they formed this Explorer post, and we went out there 2 nights a week and we worked on these things and put them back together, got them flying. And then we were given the opportunity to learn to fly for basically gas and oil, which was about $4.50 an hour. I know that's going to make you feel kind of sick if you're working on ratings these days. We had an instructor who was he was a part-time instructor at the FBO, a young fellow who was a school principal, and he believed in the program. And so he only charged us $4.50 an hour, or $5 an hour. So it was $9.50 an hour for dual, $4.50 for solo in a J3 Cub. It was a great way to learn to fly. So I soloed when I was 16, and I was licensed at 17. It was a lot of fun to be a high school student and recruit three other friends and you pool your cash and rent a Cherokee in the evening and fly up to Duluth for lunch or for dinner and then be back at school the next morning. So and everybody says, where do you go for dinner? We got Duluth, you know. So there is some magic to aviation, and we still have that today. You're going to find, if you don't already, that having airplanes is great. My wife and I, my wife is also a pilot. We've got a stable of airplanes out here, and we live on an air park. And we think nothing of hopping in an airplane and 2 hours later being in Southern California at a cabin we have in the mountains down there, or going out to the Great Basin National Park. It's about an hour and 15 minutes out to the east of here in an RV at RV speeds. So airplanes are really, really handy. So I eventually went to the University of Minnesota for aeronautical engineering. It was convenient. It was close. They were well rated. I remember reading the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo when I was a kid, and the author of that, his goal was to survive the war and then go and get his aeronautical engineering degree at the University of Minnesota, because it was rated as one of the top 3 aeronautical engineering schools in the country. And I'm absolutely certain that it was in 1944. And they didn't buy a single piece of lab equipment from that point on. So it was a little bit old-fashioned, but we did get a chance to play around with things. So when I was in college, I really planned to build airplanes. I didn't have any goals of being in the space program, and I was going to. My subtle plan was to go to work for Belanca in Alexandria. My junior year of college, they went bankrupt, and I didn't realize at the time that the natural state of the aerospace or the airplane industry is bankruptcy followed by resurrection, followed by bankruptcy, followed by resurrection, and so on and so forth. So I was kind of crushed. I figured there was no opportunity to stay in Minnesota, and no offense to the Wichita folks, but I really didn't want to go to Wichita. I've been there, and I kind of go through there on the highway. Used to go through there a lot, but I got the opportunity to sign up as a co-op student for NASA. The light bulb went off in my head when I saw the announcement. I said, "Yeah, I'll go try that. See what's going to happen." So I filled out the paperwork, sent it in, and I got a letter back a few months later saying, "Thank you for your interest in the program. Please report on this date to Building 100 at Johnson Space Center, and we'll tell you what you're going to do." So I had no idea what my co-op job was going to be. I anticipated crunching numbers or doing design work or something like that. But they assigned me to the operations group because I was already a pilot, and I was working my way through college as a diver, a scuba diver. And so they said, "Well, you know what it's like to put your own little pink body on the line. We want you in operations. We want you in mission control." And so that's what I ended up doing for all those years, being a flight controller, moving up in various positions, and doing a lot of work on the shuttle as a flying machine, a lot of the landing and deceleration work. So I spent a lot of time flying simulators and doing test pilot work in the shuttle world, and eventually was selected as flight director, and did that for quite a long time. But all that time, and for my whole life, flying airplanes has been my primary interest. It was really I was very, very fortunate to be able to work at NASA and have an airplane at the nearby small airport, and spend my time either flying spaceships or flying little airplanes. And when I got all done with NASA, I ended up at Kit Planes. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So you can see an awful lot of airplanes here on the slide that I've flown, flying around. And one of the great advantages to being an aviation journalist is that you get to fly a lot of different types of airplanes, and get exposed to a lot of stuff. So it's a really neat world.
Just one quick thing. Do you have a slideshow that you're supposed to be sharing right now?
I am. Oh, let's see. I should be sharing that screen. So you haven't missed much yet. So that's great.
I just started talking about airplane pictures. Like, I'd like to see some airplane pictures.
Yeah. Okay. Are you seeing that screen now?
Not yet. There should be a little green button down at the bottom of the share screen. There you go.
Okay. I'm sorry. First pictures weren't very important anyway. So let me just go back to this one. Yeah, got a lot of airplane pictures. I'm sure people like to see those. So a lot of different airplanes that we've had a chance to fly over the years and evaluate and test, and it's a really exciting world to do that. Okay, so we'll press on. One of the things I always like to talk about when I talk about space, we'll talk about space here for a little bit before we get back to airplanes, is that it's really all about teamwork. This is a typical flight control team near the end of the shuttle program. This was the last Hubble servicing mission, STS-125. This was my team. It was the planning team, Orbit 3, when the crew was sleeping. About 60 people, something like that. But then we also had about 50 people who ran the building, and then you've got all the engineering support, and you've got the people around the world running the network. So it's a pretty big operation. There is nobody that is unimportant. I like to illustrate that if you're going to get working in the aerospace business, you are going to you're going to start out at some position that doesn't seem that significant, but everybody on the team is important. When we would fly a mission, somewhere near the end of the flight, a box would show up from the astronaut office, and that box would have a bunch of mission patches, and it was a gift from the crew. And there was a patch for everybody who'd worked on the mission as a thank you note from the crew for working on their flight. And it was up to the flight directors to pass those out. And I always, my team knew very well that nobody on my team got a patch until Olga got a patch. And Olga was our longtime janitor in the control center. And she'd be wandering through, and she would sweep the floors, sweep the carpet, empty the trash cans, and move away the empty pizza boxes and the like. And she was just important as every flight controller in that room, because she made the place livable. And so no matter what you find yourself doing in aerospace when you get out of college, it's important. And you never want to forget that, because it's all going to lead to new things and bigger things. So let's talk a little about the space shuttle. When I started as a flight director in 1993, I had flight controllers working for me that had not been born when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And when I retired as a flight director and retired the shuttle, I had many flight controllers who had never known a time when the space shuttle wasn't flying. I mean, that's how long we flew it. It was an amazing flying machine. And I guess that many of you were born after the first flight of the shuttle back in '81, and never knew a time when it wasn't there and taking people to space until we retired it. The liftoff of the space shuttle was quite impressive. You had three main engines for a total of 1.5 million pounds thrust each, and then you had two SRBs that put out 3 million pounds each. So that's 6 million pounds, which really overwhelms the thrust from the main engines. But the solid rocket boosters were basically there in order to throw you out of the atmosphere. They were able to accelerate you to about Mach 2.5, 2.7, and get you up out of the major portion of the atmosphere. And then you get rid of them, and then you'd be horizontal by that time, and you'd use the main engines for the next 6 minutes to accelerate to orbital velocity. There was so much thrust coming out of the SRBs that when you hit T0 and the SRBs, the solid rocket boosters, lit, if the pyrotechnic bolts that held the shuttle stacked to the pad didn't fire, you were going anyways. They ripped the bolts right out of the pad. There was that much thrust. So it's pretty amazing. You had about 1.5 million pounds of fuel and oxidizer in the big external tank, the orange external tank, and it was gone in 8.5 minutes. For those of you who really have looked at historical pictures, you'll notice that the first two shuttle flights, the external tank was white, not orange. And that's because everybody thought rockets should be white, and so they painted it white. And they discovered when they were trying to increase performance after the first couple of flights that the white pigment in the paint weighed about 100 pounds, and that was 100 pounds you could take to orbit if you didn't put that in, and that's why we had a rust-colored orange foam tank for the rest of the program. The shuttle was an amazing glider, and it was definitely not a sailplane. I fly sailplanes occasionally. I've flown sailplanes that had L over Ds up to about 65 to 1, which it's hard to ever get them to come down. The shuttle had a lift drag of about 2. And you could, if you had the thickest atmosphere just before landing, and you set up the right angle of attack, you could get it to about 3.5, maybe 4. but generally it was about, we flew it at about a 2-to-1 lift to drag, and you flew it at everywhere between Mach 25 down to a touchdown of 195 knots. Stall speed was about 156, but nobody ever wanted to try and stall it because that would have been pretty bad with a delta wing like that. When you would land the shuttle, you're basically flying a very unique entry profile from orbit down, Mach 25, which was really arbitrarily defined as 25,000 feet per second. We just kind of defined Mach as 1,000 feet per second. 1,000 feet per second, because it was too complicated to change it, and it worked just fine doing it that way. And you had adaptive flight controls, which were constantly mixing aero surfaces and jets for maneuvering and load relief and everything else for the entry. You had to enter at a constant angle of attack during the hot part of entry of about 40 degrees, plus or minus a degree and a half, in order to keep from melting portions of the orbiter. And then you could control your descent rate by rolling off the lift vector. So if you picture a 40-degree angle of attack, you can maintain that angle of attack no matter how you roll about the velocity vector. And so if you rolled 90 degrees, you have no lift vector holding you up, and you're going to increase your sink rate. If you roll 45 degrees, you're going to have a portion of that initial lift vector. So you can control that sink rate purely with roll and maintain that 60-degree or 40-degree angle of attack. When you finally got down to where you were flying like an airplane, you'd cross over midfield at about Mach 1 and fly a 270-degree descending turn to final. So you'd hit 50,000 feet Mach 1 over the field. By the time you had gotten to what we'd call low key, which is essentially a beam of numbers on a kind of a downwind, it's a continuous turn, but kind of a downwind, you'd be at 30,000. Then when you were at 90 degrees or base leg, you were at 20,000. You'd intercept final at about 12,000. Come down a 19-degree glide slope to 2,000 feet, where you pre-flare the airplane. So you pull back at about 1.4 Gs. You were aimed short of the runway on the outer glide slope, and then you'd pre-flare to 1.4 Gs to aim yourself up to the runway to about a half-degree glide slope, where you'd want to go and hold that attitude touchdown. If you fooled with pitch very much, because it was a delta wing airplane, and anytime you pitch up, the elevons go up, so it kills lift and that increases your sink rate. It was really easy to get into a PIO. So you really had to stay well ahead of the game, ahead of the airplane, and make sure that you didn't do much maneuvering down low. This picture shows the drag chute, which, believe it or not, we did not have until after the Challenger accident, and actually a few flights after the Challenger accident, after the return to flight. We developed that because we had undersized brakes, undersized wheels, tires that were blowing, the nose wheel steering didn't work. It was a real problem landing. And so we did a lot of incremental improvements, but the drag chute attached up on the tail actually gave you a real advantage because it tended to pitch you up, and then you could derotate. You'll notice when you look at this picture that the vehicle sat nose low about 4 degrees, so a negative alpha about 4 degrees. And as you derotate to get it onto the nose wheel, that last 4 degrees, you're actually increasing your descent rate, and it really slammed onto the nose wheel. And so the drag chute would hold the nose up, and then you could push the nose down with elevons, and you'd use those opposing forces to give you a softer nose wheel touchdown. It also significantly shortened landing distances without having to use the brakes. We developed the drag chute kind of empirically in a simulator out at Ames Research Center back in the mid-'80s after the Challenger accident. This was a very interesting simulator. It's called the Vertical Motion Simulator. Some of you might have heard of it. You take a standard roll, pitch, and yaw motion-based simulator, and you put it on a little trolley so that it can go forward and backward about 20 feet. Then that allows you to get some X motion, sustained X motion, and you can feel that in the seat of your pants. And then you take that trolley and you put it on another trolley, which moves left and right about 40 feet in either direction. So you can get sustained Y-axis loading. and that feels that you can feel that side loading if you're on the runway and you have blown tires or brake lockups or something. Then you take that assembly and you put it on top of a bridge which moves up and down 6 stories within the simulator building, and you get sustained Z loading. And so it was a very, very accurate feeling motion-based simulator. And we developed the drag chute basically in software. We went to lunch and told the guys, hey, why don't you give us a drag chute? And all it was a force at a point on the vehicle. And they taped some switches to the glare shield, and we got in it and tried the first development test runs. And I was in the left seat, and I had a guy in the right seat who was pulling gear and punching the drag chute, and we touched down. When you touch down, the flight control system moded from in the air to on the ground. And so we touched down, and I called for the chute, and he hit the chute button, and I instantly knew that the chute was way too big and it was mounted way too high on the vertical tail, because it pitched us back up, which of course lifted us back in the air because the simulator knew what the dynamics was. And of course now I'm back in the air with no flight control, and I just said, this is really going to hurt. And we ran away to the basement. The thing just dropped, and yeah, it kind of bruised us a little bit when we hit, and all the mechanical fuses disconnected to save the simulator. But it was a lot of good times, and you can do an awful lot of interesting flying even though you're bolted to the earth. This is the front end, the front office of the shuttle back near the end of the program when we'd gone to a glass cockpit. The early shuttle was all steam gauges, mechanical, beautiful 8 balls and HSIs and tape instruments. Unfortunately, we got to the point in the program where all the guys who knew how to fix that stuff not only had retired, but they'd all died. So there was nobody left who could maintain them. And so we went to a glass cockpit, although we did not significantly increase the intelligence of the glass cockpit. We basically just reproduced the steam gauges on glass, because then we didn't have to change a lot of our procedures. But you had a center console with all the critical instrumentation and the keyboards. They were hex keyboards you talk to the computer with, and main displays up there. This was an on-orbit simulation. This was actually the last generic space shuttle simulation ever conducted. And I was in the left seat as the commander. One of my flight controls was in the right seat, and then we had mission control tied in. So the reason some of those screens are blank is that on orbit you turn some of the screens off to save power. But it was a great machine, and you could handle it with 2 people, but it really helped to have a third person behind the center console, flight engineer for failures. When I was selected as flight director, we had been starting to work with the Russians for a few years. I was one of the first people who went to Moscow with a very small team, a flight director and about 5 of us flight controllers and flight planners, to develop what we could do with the Russians in space. And it was we'd been directed to do that by our respective presidents. And what we came up with was the fact that they had a space station but no shuttle. We had a shuttle but no space station. We said, well, let's fly our shuttle to your station, and it sounded like a good thing to do. And we did that for about 10 flights. We populated the Mir with an astronaut for most of that time, and we would bring new ones up and bring them back, and it was a very, very exciting time to fly. The very first mission that I flew as a flight director after a year of training was STS-63, the first rendezvous mission with the Mir, and it was kind of interesting because my very first shift, I came on as the planning shift, which is the shift when the crew goes to sleep. And on that particular flight, the way the day-night cycles worked out, that was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Houston time. And when you come on about that time to take over, the back row of mission control is kind of heavily populated with senior managers, operations guys. So the boss, the chief of the flight director office was there. The lead flight director for the mission was there. Gene Kranz was in the back row. The head of mission operations, flight operations for shuttle was there. They're all there because we got a shuttle in the air, and they figured they better check in before they go home for the evening. And so I came on and was taking the handover. And shortly after launch, they'd had a leaking jet. And in order to secure that leaking jet, they had to close one of the manifolds, which took out a great number of jets. And that's what you had to do if you had a leaker. We were down to where if we had to close another manifold and lose more jets, we were not going to be able to rendezvous with the mirror, because we had to have a very, very precise set of jets to prevent blowing the solar arrays off of them with our plumes. Well, sure enough, as soon as we'd finished the handover, I'd taken over with crew was asleep. My prop officer called and said, "Flight, I got bad news. We have another leaking jet." I said, "Are we going to have to close the manifold?" And he said, I'm afraid so. That's what the rules say. And here, being the brand new flight director, I'm in charge. I've signed for the vehicle. My first thought is, well, I wonder what all these bright, my senior management behind me think. So I turned around to look at them and get a little bit of advice from all of these legends, and it was dead quiet. And Randy Stone, the head of mission operations, finally broke the silence. He looked at me and said, "Well, Di, what the hell are you going to do now?" And I realized at that time that they'd all been flight directors, and they said, the guy who signed for the vehicle is the one who has to make the decision. They were not going to help me, and they were not going to take the job away from me. And so I turned back around and I said, "Well, guys, we've got to close the jets," and we powered up the comm system and woke the crew up and closed the manifold. And fortunately, with a couple of days of hard work, we were able to figure out how to make a rendezvous work, and we didn't lose the mission. But that's the kind of authority that the flight director has in mission control. We have absolute authority to take whatever action we feel necessary for the safe and successful completion of the mission. We eventually ended up building the space station, and I hope that you all have had a chance to go outside and see it some night. You can go to the NASA website and sign up for emails. It'll tell you when you put in your coordinates, and it'll give you a good indication of when it's coming overhead. It flies overhead frequently. Probably we'll get 3 passes 3 days in a row, and then it won't see it for about a week, and then we'll get another 3 passes. And it's really, really neat to see that go overhead on a dark night and look up and say, we built that. It's the size of a football field. It's the brightest star in the sky when it goes overhead. And it's humankind's home built in space. It is really a neat machine. It took 34, 35 missions to assemble it. And most of the major components had never been joined on the ground because they couldn't be. The gravity wouldn't allow it. And so everything fit together. It was just a triumph of engineering. We had a few little issues here and there, but nothing major. And we were able to get the whole thing completed in about 10 years. It's now seeing commercial transports. We've been sending commercial cargo vehicles up for quite a few years. And now, of course, I'm sure you're aware that SpaceX brought the first humans up there a few months ago. And they're getting ready to launch the first operational crew mission on the Crew Dragon. And then we'll see the Boeing vehicle. And pretty soon it's going to be served by commercial taxi service, which is pretty neat. Well, I eventually retired from NASA. After we retired the space shuttle, space station was not quite the same because you don't have that airplane quality to it. And I was getting close to retirement age. And so I decided it was time to move on to the next part of my career. And that's how I ended up as the editor-in-chief of Kit Planes magazine. So I had started writing for the magazine about 3 or 4 years before that. I'd been doing a lot of writing for aviation type clubs that I belonged to, and then on the internet, when the internet came up, the various forums, experimental aviation forums. Some of you might have heard of vansairforce.net, which is a big online community for the Vans RV airplanes. And I did a lot of writing there, and I suddenly got this call from the editor-in-chief of Kit Planes magazine saying, "I've read your stuff." He says, "You've got a lot to say, and I like your style, and I'd like you to write for me." So I started doing that. And when it became known that I was retiring from NASA, I got a call from the owners of Kit Planes saying, "We'd really like you to." Mark, who was then the editor-in-chief, wanted to move on, and they said, "We'd really like to be our editor-in-chief." I had always thought that being an aviation writer would be really cool. I mean, I started out getting my first subscription to Flying Magazine back in probably 1974 or 73, and read guys like Ernie Gunn and Gordon Baxter and Len Morgan, and thought, boy, that would be a really cool life. And I never really figured out how that would happen, but it did. when they asked me to run the magazine, I said, I have no earthly idea how to run a magazine. They said, that's okay. We've got people who can do that for you. We want a technical expert. And so I gave it a shot, and I figured I could fool them for a couple of years before they fired me for incompetence. And 6.5 years later, I was still an editor-in-chief, and realizing that the worst thing about running a monthly magazine is that they expect you to put one out every single month, and you really don't have much time off. So I negotiated a promotion for myself to editor at large, which means I have all the fun. I get to do all the flying. I get to write when I want, but I don't have to actually produce the magazine. And we brought Mark Cook back to be editor-in-chief again. So you never know how you're going to end up, but it gives you a really neat break, and you get to do a lot of really interesting flying. A lot of these airplanes that are on the covers were things that I got to fly, I give you a little insider view of aviation media in case any of you are thinking that would be a neat place to go. Fundamentally, I write, and I grew up writing. I always tell people that the key to being a good writer is to read a lot. And growing up in the upper Midwest, you do read a lot, because what else are you going to do for the 6 months of winter but stay inside and read? You become a good writer by reading people that you enjoy, and then basically stealing from them in terms of style and technique. And your writing is nothing more than a composite of all the people you've read before. But I'm really still just a pilot and a builder. Magazines aren't as big as you might think. We have a very small staff. Kit Planes Magazine has an editor-in-chief who's about half-time. We have an executive editor who's paid for full-time, an art director who does the layouts for about half-time, and an advertising manager. And that's basically the staff. The writers are mostly pilots and builders and designers. There are no staff writers. Everybody is somebody who wants to be an aviation writer, who has some other job. Hopefully they have another job, otherwise they're not going to make a living writing for a magazine. Average pay for an article is about $500, and you can add that up. It's really hard to make a living that way. But I would recruit from my little black book people that I knew as pilots and as builders and as designers to share their techniques and ideas and their skills with the customers. Like I say, it doesn't pay very much. Specialty magazines cost more. If you ever subscribe, cost more than a magazine like Sports Illustrated, which costs about $12 a year. Because you really have to pay for the content. Big magazines are paid for by advertising. Small, and you basically are paying the postage, which costs about $1 an issue to mail, even at a media rate. And what I tell people is that it's good to subscribe to a broad variety of aviation magazines so you get a good view. I've been a subscriber to Flying for over 50 years, and it sure has changed over the years. I'm not sure for the better here right now, but it's always good to know what's going on. Sport Aviation is a great magazine to read if you're an EAA. You're all EAA members, because it has such a wide variety of things to see. So let's talk a little bit about home building, which is the heart of EAA. I built my RV-8 when we were down after the Columbia accident. So this first flew in about 2005. I had owned a Yankee before that. I'd owned a J3 Cub before that. I did a lot of modifications to my Yankee. I basically did every STC you could possibly do to it. A bigger engine. I made it IFR. I painted it, stripped and painted it, did an interior, put in extended range fuel tanks, lots of different things. But I wanted to build something from scratch, and the RV-8 was an amazing airplane. This one was a quick build, and it took me about 1,000 hours to build, working in the evenings. It is still what I think of as the thoroughbred of the line of the RVs. It's maneuverable, it's aerobatic, it's got good range, it's got good load carrying capability. Oops, you don't want to do that. It's just a really fun airplane. Now I'll talk about another airplane later that eclipses this, but this is a great traveling machine as well as something that you can fly aerobatics in. The next airplane put my name on was the RV3 that we called Samsiu, which is a little tongue-in-cheek name from the movie Avatar. We painted it to look like one of the flying creatures in Avatar, and Samsiu means warrior in the Na'vi language that they created for that movie. The RV3 is an example, is a great example of almost the perfect airplane. It's very, very light on the controls. We've got a constant speed prop with driven by an IO 320, fuel injected 320. So this airplane will do 8 knots over airframe redline in level flight at sea level, or it will climb at 3,000 feet a minute. You can climb it up and leave here at Lake Tahoe and be in Oshkosh in 8 hours with 2 fuel stops. It's a full IFR machine, and when you get there, you can do a complete aerobatic routine. So it just does everything well. The best thing about a single seat airplane is the quality of the social experience. It's just a wonderful thing to have a good single seater that's really, really light and easy to fly. The only thing about an RV3 is that it is the RV8 is a pre-punched kit. You can buy a quick build. The fuselage looks like an airplane. The wings are done. The RV3, basically you get some hieroglyphics on some sheets of mimeograph paper and the deed to a bauxite mine. And the first thing you do is build your aluminum smelter. So it's a challenge to build, but it's well worth it. This was built, my wife and I built this together so that I got married, but after the RV8, and believe it or not, guys, I met my wife at an RV fly-in. She had an RV6 that she had bought. And so, you can find women in the aviation world. This is another project that came along that we're still flying. It's a Dream Tundra. We found this, we were looking for a bush plane out here in Nevada. My wife's a geology professor. She wanted to go out in the middle of nowhere and pick up rocks and camp. And this does a good job of that. It's a 4-seat aluminum Canadian design. They didn't sell very many kits. They sold about 38 kits. And it has a few growing pains because we're early adopters of the design, but it will haul. We rarely put the back seats in, so we kind of call it two people and an elk. It's a useful load with full fuel, and it really will get in and out of just about any place that it's reasonable to take an airplane. Got an IO 360 constant speed prop on it. It holds 56 gallons of fuel. If you lean it out, lean a peak, you can fly for about 9 hours at 100 knots. And we've taken it to Oshkosh twice, and it's a long couple of days getting it back and forth to Oshkosh from here. The next airplane that I built, some of you may have seen some of this, is my Subsonics. This is a little single-seat, single-engine jet. It's powered by a 260-pound thrust PBS TJ100 engine. It's a Czech an engine from the Czech Republic near Prague. The hot section of this engine was developed as an APU many decades ago in the Eastern Bloc. So there's a lot of history on the hot section. This is a case where the engine package, which is sitting up on top of the fuselage there, is more than the entire rest of the airframe and avionics package entirely. It's about $65,000 for the engine now. But if you're used to flying pistons, this is just dirt simple. It's a full FADEC engine. You take the throttle out of detent and it starts, and then you just move the throttle where you want to go to fly. And when you're done, you take it back across the detent to shut it down, and it takes care of itself. Great little airplane. What can I say? It's a jet. If you draw a 250-mile radius circle around your home base, and then you put a dot on every airport that has an airport restaurant or a pancake breakfast on Saturday mornings by an EAA chapter, and on any given Saturday, you're the guy who shows up in a jet. You just have to see how much that's worth for you. So I first flew the jet for the magazine. I was the first guy to fly the prototype other than the factory test pilot. And I was able to get my type rating in that. And then I really wanted to fly it again. And John Monette, the owner of Sonex in Wisconsin, always said, "Oh yeah, anytime you get by here, you want to fly it, it's here." And every time I'd go to Oshkosh and I'd wander over to Sonex, the airplane was out of annual, or it was off on a tour, or wasn't available. And I finally realized that. I told John, I said, I finally figured out, if I really want to fly one again, I'm going to have to buy one. And he laughed and said, "Yeah, that's probably the case." So my kit was delivered in November of 2018, and construction took about 75 half days, about 425 hours. So it builds very, very quickly. The airframe is significantly pre-built. Pretty much the only structural work you do is you build the tail and you build the flaps and ailerons, and everything else is systems work. When it shows up, it looks like this. Even the canopy and the windshield are fitted. The stub wings are part of the main spar, or the center section sticks out about 2 feet on either side. And then the wing panels themselves are very, very small, and they bolt on. Once it's finished, you can take the wings off and put this in a trailer in about a half hour. It's really, really simple. It's just 4 bolts on the top of the main spar, 4 bolts on the bottom of the main spar, all accessible from outside, and then 1 for the rear spar, and then 1 bolt disconnects the aileron linkages. The wings come right off. The thing is so easy to build. The original kits did not meet the EAA 50 or the EAB 51% rule, and so they had to undo some of the work on later kits to make it qualify for EAB certification. Tail is very simple. It's a V tail. It's actually a Y tail. So you've got a rudder, a little vestigial rudder that hangs down below. It helps a little bit with yaw stability. V tails are well known for wagging their tail in turbulence. They're not tremendously lateral stability. They don't have a lot of lateral stability, but it's very, very simple structure. Everything's pre-punched and it goes together pretty quickly. And you do have to build the tail. Installing the engine is a piece of cake. If any of you have ever done a home built when you've had to do the firewall forward, I tell people to install the firewall forward, the engine, the prop, all of the plumbing and the cowling on an RV is about a 300-hour job if you know what you're doing. The installing the engine on this is my wife. You just say, "Here, Louise, would you hold this 42-pound engine in position while I drop in the front bolt and the back bolt, and then I plug in 3 connectors for electrical, and then attach the fuel line and snug it down." That's it. Engine firewall forward is complete. That's all there is to it. Very, very straightforward. It's very nice having the engine out there in the open. It's easy to work on. There's nothing to work on except to check oil. Except that when it's mounted up high like that, it does give you significant pitching moments when you add or take off power. So when you add power on the jet, it pitches down significantly. When you take off power, it pitches up significantly. You have to plan for that, or you can really get surprised, especially if you're maneuvering close to the ground. You do have to do some wiring and plumbing. This is the avionics bay, which is the instrument panel is here on the right. This is looking down through where the windshield area is. Now the instrument panel's on the right, the nose is to the left. The batteries are up forward of your feet as ballast, and then basically it's just wiring. This wasn't finished. This was in process, so I don't wire that sloppy. This is just how it looks when you're halfway done. And when you're done, you have a pretty neat looking airplane. So we had this painted by John Starr, who came out to my shop and painted it. He's an airbrush artist. All of the detail on the airplane is airbrushed, and he painted this airplane from bare aluminum to finished in 6 days. And on the 7th day, he rested. It was an amazing to be part of that process. The emblem on the belly is the flight director insignia. Only those of us who've signed for a crewed spacecraft in orbit are allowed to use that. Comes back from the Gene Kranz days. So the airplane is really a kick to fly. It doesn't outperform in climb the RVs, but you can get up to 17.5 and go about 200 knots on about 17.5 gallons an hour. The cockpit, of course, is another single seater, very, very simple with a side stick, throttle over on the left, This one is, I have an MGL ethos, which I designed it around. Landing gear, we have a safety pin to make sure that the landing gear that you don't retract it on the ground. The red handle here is for the BRS, the whole aircraft parachute, because there is just no place to wear. There's no way to wear a parachute in this airplane, and getting out would be problematic anyway. So having the chute is a significant benefit where I live, because we fly over the mountains all the time. And some of these trees out here, I learned to fly back in the Midwest, and you always figured that if you were over a forest and had an engine failure, you could just stall it into the treetops and they'd let you down nice and easy. The problem out here in the mountains of the West is that the trees are 300 feet high. And if you stall it into the treetops, you're still going to fall about 20 stories after you've decelerated. So the chute is a very useful little thing to have. You'll see a couple of bags of lead shot here in the wheel wells. That's because the airplane without a pilot sits on its tail. Then it doesn't look very good when you're just flying it or it's sitting in the hangar. So we put a little lead shot bags up there in the footwells when it's parked. And let's see, we got one more shot of that. So this is the cockpit single seat. The fuel tank is right behind the pilot. It's in the fuselage with you. It sits on the CG. It's the only place to put 40 gallons of fuel. The BRS is up here behind it, and the rocket is behind the fuel tank. If you were to fire the BRS, it would take this whole rear panel off the airplane with it. It's bolted on with nylon screws. So it's a really fun machine, and something you should, if you're a pilot, it would be a fun thing to fly. I can tell you that. So I do fly an awful lot of different airplanes, and one of the things I do is a lot of flight testing. And I like to point out the Cooper Harper scale for flight testing. This is the handling qualities rating scale. So basically, you set yourself a task. For instance, touching down at a particular spot on the runway, and you say the first question over here is it controllable? First off, if a rating of 1 is perfect and a rating of 10 is unflyable, you ask yourself, is it controllable? If it's not controllable, it's a 10. It needs to be fixed. If it's controllable, is adequate performance attainable with a tolerable pilot workload? No, then it's a 7, 8, or 9. If it is tolerable, then you pass that gate. Is it satisfactory without improvement? No, I think they should improve it. It's a 4, 5, or a 6. And if it's okay to fly without, it's then a 1, 2, or 3. A 1 is don't touch a thing. Just absolutely, I don't want you to make any changes to this airplane. It's perfect. I was able to fly a Wright Flyer simulator one time, which you actually laid down on the lower wing and you flew it with a cradle. I used to fly one a lot at Oshkosh, but that was with the Microsoft Flight Simulator flight load, which actually was much more flyable than the real thing. I flew one that Ames developed the flight parameters for at one time off of the real Wright Flyer. And I was able to fly just a little bit longer than the longest that the Wright brothers flew on their first flight, because I knew what I was supposed to be doing. But it was really an 11. The Wright Flyer was an 11. That was a completely unflyable airplane. It flew in ground effect, and that was about it. So once you learn the Cooper Harper rating, you can go and fly a lot of things and do a lot of ratings, and you develop a lot of confidence in your abilities by flying a lot of different kinds of airplane. Training in flight test operations really helps. It's a mindset. We do not take significant risks. We try to minimize risks all the time. You want to go out and you evaluate airplanes for stability and performance. This is how you develop handling quality ratings, and you go out and test and see what the performance is. When you test an airplane for a magazine, you basically want to say, how does it fly? Then you want to know, what's the kit like? How's it going to be to build? And lastly, what's the company like? Because when a person buys a kit for an airplane, they're marrying that company. You really are dependent on that company to supply you with spares and the like. And it's important to know how they're doing. So I'll talk about some of the airplanes I've had a chance to fly. You really do get to fly some neat airplanes. This is a 90% scale Spitfire with a 450 horse Chevy V8 belt drive to a constant speed prop. The kit had been flown. I talked to a fellow who'd flown a full-scale Spitfire and flew this version, and he said it handled exactly the same. What's really interesting about the Spitfire is that if you're used to flying a modern tail dragger rudder airplane like an RV, the rudders on an RV are very stiff, and you really have to put a lot of boot in to get it to point the nose. The Spitfire, you could point the nose 10, 15 degrees off your direction of flight with very little effort at all, and pitch was light as well. And I couldn't figure this out until I thought about what that meant. You see, a fighter plane is a gun platform, and its whole point is to aim guns. And yeah, you want to be able to pull the nose up and down to raise the gun up and down, and you want to be able to move it left and right very easily to point that gun. And the Spitfire did that very, very well. It was a wonderful handling airplane. It flew like a very, very forgiving plane, and it landed at a reasonably slow speed on grass. And British pilots basically they learned to fly off grass, and that's and you might ground loop it, but you probably weren't going to do any damage. Here's another really fun airplane, the Hummingbird. The Hummingbird, you do not get into this airplane, you put it on. It is the tiniest single-seater that I've ever flown. About the only thing I know of that's smaller is the Cry, which I haven't had a chance to fly yet. The Hummingbird has a half VW engine. So they basically take the 4-cylinder VW and they chop it in half. They just keep the front 2 cylinders and put a back plate on it. So it's all of 35 screaming horsepower. And it flies like an airplane. You're really close to the ground. It doesn't go very fast, but probably about 90, something like that. And but you're only burning about 2.5 gallons an hour. So it's a really neat little airplane to fly. And then I think I got one more picture here that's kind of interesting. The Murphy Radical. Murphy Aircraft up in Canada has a line of airplanes that the top end is the Moose with the Polish radial on it. The Radical has an 0360, and I like this picture because of the bike racks. I'd never flown an airplane where I had an external cargo like this, and I liked it so much I built a set of racks for my Tundra. And it does slow the airplane down about 10 knots, but if you do have only one bike, or if a bike self-jettisons, it's still controllable. It's not like losing a single engine in a twin. It's a neat airplane to fly, and good for backcountry strips. And when you get there, you can unload your mountain bike and take off down a trail. Let's see. And then there's just a variety of other airplanes that I've had a chance to play around with. The Tarragon is a European airplane with the Rotax engine that really scoots. In Europe, it's a light sport, but because it's got retractable gear, it couldn't be licensed as a light sport in this country. The Carbon Cub, if you ever have a chance to fly one, if you fly Cubs and then you fly a Carbon Cub, you'll say that this is the ultimate refinement in a Super Cub. The Carbon Cub is not cheap, but it is a really fun short field airplane. The Zenith Super Cruiser, interesting airplane. It's got a 200 horsepower motor, big tires. You can land it in about 100 feet, take off in about the same distance. It has no big instrument panel. It's got an instrument panel that moves around on a gimbal television mount. You can put it wherever you want. You can see in all directions. This is the Vans RV-12 IS. I flew that. I think I was flying that on its 3rd test flight. I'd shown up there to do a magazine review, and it hadn't flown yet. And I hung around and ended up being a flight test engineer for it. It's a really, really nice airplane in the LSA world. And then the little Casset Racer. The Casset is another single-seat airplane that if you fly a lot of airplanes, you should fly one at least once. They got a little short prop. They have no starter, and they've got a very, very high, a large RPM range. They run them way, way over redline for an 0200, and so because of the large RPM range, you have a significant mixture range, and it's really easy to add power or pull power off and have the mixture in the wrong place and kill the motor. And if you kill the motor, it's such a small prop, it won't keep windmilling. And remember, I said it doesn't have a starter. So now you're dead sticking at 100 miles an hour into a cornfield, and it's not a real pleasant airplane. So you really want to make sure that you have a runway in reach when you fly that, was my conclusion. One of the things about flying a lot of different airplanes is that you get a healthy respect for risk, and you can get a lot of experience in managing it. The key to living a long aviation life is to use common sense. and always look for what you're missing. It is just shocking how many things you will notice that you get away with that you didn't even realize there was a danger at the time. And later on, you look back and you go, holy smokes, I really, really dodged a bullet on that one. So you want to be looking out of the box. You want to be looking at things that could be hazardous. You know, we're all human. We all make mistakes. And so always have a plan to deal with them when they happen. I always tell people, you don't plan for if the engine quits, you plan for when the engine quits. And you want to know what you're going to do to deal with it, right? So that's how you stay alive in aviation, and and uh, and how you live a long life flying a lot of different airplanes. Let's see. A lot of what I've talked about here tonight, you can see in a book that I put out earlier this year. You can find Shuttle Flight online at most of your aviation bookseller, or most of your better booksellers. It was put out by a major publisher. And I really talk a lot about how risk is managed in a very high risk flight environment. It's Shuttle Houston, Life in the Center Seat of Mission Control. And it was really stories of what it was like to plan, train, and fly shuttle missions. So there's a lot of this risk management stuff is in there for people to learn from. Just to wrap up here, and then I'll open up for questions. I have really had an amazing opportunity to serve humankind's quest and venture into space. I got there not intentionally, but once I got there, I realized what kind of an opportunity it was, and I put everything I had into it. I really have had marvelous opportunities as an aviator. I've now flown something like 140 different airplanes as pilot in command, and I learned something new with every single one of them. It's really an exciting job to have, and you know, you need to develop a little caution. It's really fun to go out and fly a lot of different new airplanes, but you also have to develop the ability to say, no, sir, I am not going to fly that airplane. I have turned airplanes down. I've turned airplanes down that I have traveled to fly. When I got there, I looked at the airplane and said, this just isn't worth the risk. There are too many problems with it. Fix this, 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 and this, and then we'll talk about me coming back to fly it. I want to thank you for giving me the chance to chat with you tonight. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'll open, if I can remember how to do that. There we go. And I'll open it up to any questions you might have.
I'll go first. I was writing